3 Hells Angels members accused of that shooting on Sunday that injured 7 stood in front of a judge today.
The Hells Angels Motorcycle Club has a long history of notorious bikers. Let me show you some of the most dangerous Hells Angels to ever exist. Yves Trudeau, also known as Apache and the Mad Bomber. Born in 1946 in Quebec, Canada, Trudeau's upbringing was far from luxurious. He grew up in a tough neighborhood where violence was a common occurrence. He had this fascination early in life with bikers, military things, weapons, and bombs. Trudeau took a job with an explosives factory to learn how to handle explosives and would become an expert at building bombs. As a teenager, he became involved in street fights and small-time crime, which eventually led him down the path of becoming a full-fledged outlaw biker. Trudeau quickly became a prominent member of the Hells Angels and enjoyed inflicting pain on his victims and would go to great lengths to prove his dominance. He earned his nickname Apache as he was known for his Apache style of fighting, which involved attacking his victims with a tomahawk. In fact, he was known to carry a tomahawk with him wherever he went. Apache later became one of the key players in the Lennoxville Massacre, a mass murder that shook the foundations of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club in Canada. The incident occurred on March 24, 1985, at a clubhouse in Lennoxville, Quebec, and resulted in the deaths of 5 members of the club. The incident that led to the Lennoxville Massacre started with a dispute between 2 Hells Angels factions in Quebec. The Lennoxville chapter, led by Maurice "Mom" Boucher, was at odds with the Montreal chapter, which was led by a man named Yvon Lechat Lamoth. Trudeau was also involved in the kidnapping and murder of a young man named Charles Lechat Miller. Miller was a drug dealer who owed the Hells Angels a large sum of money. Trudeau and his accomplices kidnapped Miller, tortured him for days, and eventually killed him. The murder was particularly gruesome, with Trudeau chopping off Miller's arms and legs with a chainsaw and then burning his body. Trudeau was eventually arrested and convicted for Miller's murder, as well as other crimes. He spent years in prison, but even behind bars, he remained a feared figure. Maurice "Mom" Boucher. The year was 1994, and the city of Montreal was in the midst of a brutal turf war between rival biker clubs. At the center of the conflict was Maurice Boucher, the infamous leader of the Quebec chapter of the Hells Angels and one of the most dangerous members in the club's history. Maurice Boucher was born in 1953 in Quebec City and grew up in a working-class family. As a young man, he worked as a laborer, a bartender, and even a bouncer. But his true calling was in the world of crime, and he found his niche in the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Boucher quickly rose through the ranks of the Hells Angels and quickly became arguably one of the most dangerous Hells Angels members. One of Boucher's most notorious crimes was the kidnapping of a wealthy businessman named Eric Lapointe. Lapointe was held captive for several months while Boucher and his fellow club members demanded a ransom of $1 million. The kidnapping made headlines across Canada, and it was a clear demonstration of the Hells Angels' power and influence. But Boucher's reign of terror didn't stop there. He was also involved in the infamous Quebec Biker War, a bloody conflict between the Hells Angels and rival biker clubs. The war had started as a battle for control over the lucrative drug trade in Quebec, with the Hells Angels pitted against a rival club called the Rock Machine. But it quickly escalated into a bloody conflict, with shootings, bombings, and assassinations becoming a regular occurrence. Boucher was one of the key figures in the conflict, and he was responsible for ordering the murders of several rival club members. Boucher was eventually arrested and charged with a number of crimes, including murder, conspiracy, and drug trafficking. He was sentenced to life in prison, but even behind bars, he remained a dangerous and influential figure. In fact, Boucher's influence was so great that he was able to orchestrate a number of murders and other crimes from his prison cell. One of Boucher's most audacious moves was the murder of 2 prison guards in 1997. He had organized the killing from behind bars, using smuggled cell phones and coded messages to communicate with his men on the outside. He was eventually transferred to a maximum security facility and died at the age of 69 in prison from natural causes. Walter Stadnick. One of the most feared of them all is the man who's generally credited with turning the Hells Angels into the dominant outlaw biker club in Canada. Stadnick had a reputation that preceded him. He was known as a mastermind of criminal activity, with connections to some of the most notorious organized crime figures in North America. And it wasn't just rumors. Stadnick had a rap sheet a mile long, with charges ranging from drug trafficking to murder. But what made Stadnick so dangerous wasn't his criminal activity. It was his ability to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. He was a master of deception, often using fake identities and aliases to avoid detection. Stadnick's involvement in the international drug trade was legendary. He was known to have imported large quantities of cocaine from South America into Canada and the United States, making him a significant figure in the international drug trade. And it wasn't just drugs. Stadnick was involved in a wide range of criminal enterprises, from illegal gambling to money laundering to extortion. But what really set Stadnick apart from other Hells Angels members was his penchant for violence. He was not afraid to get his hands dirty, and was implicated in several murders over the years. One of his most infamous killings was the murder of a rival drug dealer in 1997. Stadnick's willingness to use violence to achieve his goals made him a feared and respected figure among the criminal underworld. And it wasn't just in North America that Stadnick made a name for himself. He was instrumental in the Hells Angels expansion into Europe and Asia, establishing Hells Angels chapters in countries such as Norway and Japan. Sonny Barger. Born in 1938, Sonny was a founding member of the Oakland, California chapter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club in 1957. Reportedly, Barger's criminal career began in the early 1960s when he led the Hells Angels on a violent rampage in California, shortly after he helped establish the Hells Angels Oakland chapter. Barger was linked to numerous high-profile crimes. In 1965, Barger and a group of Hells Angels went to a Rolling Stones concert at Altamont Speedway in California. The concert quickly turned violent, and a young man named Meredith Hunter was killed by a member of the Hells Angels. Barger was later charged with conspiracy to commit murder, but the charges were dropped due to a lack of evidence. In 1972, Barger was involved in the bombing of the clubhouse of a rival motorcycle club called the Outlaws in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The bombing killed a young girl and injured several others. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but was released after only 2 years due to good behavior. Barger's criminal career continued well into the 21st century. In 2002, he was arrested and charged with conspiring to murder members of the rival Mongols Motorcycle Club. However, the case was later dismissed due to lack of evidence. George Christie Jr. Christie was born in 1947 and grew up in California. He became involved with the Hells Angels in the early 1970s and quickly rose through the ranks to become the president of the Ventura chapter in 1978. In the 1980s, Christie began to expand the Hells Angels' criminal activities into drug trafficking. He and his fellow club members became involved in the production and distribution of methamphetamine, which they called crank. They also extorted money from local business owners and engaged in acts of violence against rival clubs. One of Christie's most notorious crimes occurred in 1984, when he and several other Hells Angels members kidnapped and murdered a rival drug dealer named Michael O'Farrell. O'Farrell had been selling drugs in Ventura without the Hells Angels' permission, and Christie saw him as a threat to the club's power in the area. After kidnapping Farrell, Christie and his fellow club members beat him injected him with drugs, and eventually killed him. His body was found several months later in a shallow grave. Christie was eventually arrested and charged with murder, but he managed to avoid conviction by striking a plea deal with the prosecutors. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he only served 6 before being released on parole. After his release, Christie continued to be involved in the Hells Angels' criminal activities, including drug trafficking and extortion. He was eventually expelled from the club in 2011, but he remained a prominent figure in the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs. Who do you think is the most dangerous Hells Angels member? Let us know in the comments and subscribe to the Crooks to see more videos like this. See ya!